Greetings, everyone, and welcome to the edition of our monthly webinar of Restoring Landscapes from Seeds to Success. My name is Eric Winford. I'm an assistant professor of rangeland ecology at the University of Idaho. I'm based in Boise. And my co-producer on this webinar series is Lauren King from the University of Idaho Extension. And this is a monthly webinar every fourth Thursday of the month, 11 a.m. Pacific and 12 noon Mountain Time, where we cover a number of topics related to restoration success, and restoration projects. This month, we have with us Samuel DeGrey, who's the Agricultural Extension Educator, University of Idaho Extension in Boundary County, who's going to be talk about native seed propagation. And I invite you to stick around for the full hour because after Samuel's done talking, we'll have time for questions. And you can just enter your question in the Q&A box or the chat box, and I'll get to that. And also, at the end of the webinar, there is a short survey that we ask you to fill out, just as that'll help us understand how effective these presentations are, as well as understand potential topics for future presenters. We do have a topic for next month, May 28th. We'll be talking about a Xena Creek Fish Passage project from Wes Keller, who's from the Nez Perce tribe. Okay, with that, I'm going to turn it over to Samuel. Samuel, thanks a lot for being here.
Thank you, Eric. And I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. So are they able to, well, first of all, are you guys seeing my screen presenter view?
Yes.
Cool. Are you guys able to talk in the chat normally, or can they only enter the Q&A box?
They can talk in the chat.
Okay, cool. Alrighty then. Let's get started with the talk. So this is a class on native plant seed saving and propagation. It's kind of like geared towards the small scale homeowner, sort of like kind of how to start thinking about rewilding your yard or garden. So probably not like a large scale kind of restoration project. Specifically with like locally sourced seed. So we're going to go through like how to actually figure out which plants are native, how to identify those plants, which plants would make the most sense for your property, and then also just some of the general seed saving techniques that will work for any plant, and then some of the specific techniques for breaking seed coat dormancy that native plants generally require, like scarification and stratification, all that kind of stuff. Um, Sorry. All right. So starting off with a little bit of a self-introduction. So I am the extension educator, one of two extension educators in Boundary County, Idaho. So that's Idaho's northernmost county. So I'm way up by the Canadian border. Um, so my job is basically to support agriculture in Boundary County with science-based education. I do all kinds of stuff in that job. Like I'm the master gardener program coordinator for our county. I teach classes like this one. I help people who just call the office asking me all kinds of stuff. I do like a little bit of research and I actually have a research background. And I've lived all over the state of Idaho, so I'm pretty familiar with the state as a whole. Um, with that in mind, I will say that I originally developed this class for first my master gardeners here in Boundary County, and then I also taught it in Sandpoint. I'm teaching it here in Boundary County again. So there's a lot of local references, and I'll point those out and maybe give some alternatives or other resources where you could find something that makes more sense for your area. But on that note, this is why I asked Eric if you guys are able to enter in the chat. Why don't you guys go ahead and throw where you're at in the chat right now, and that will kind of give me an idea of like what sort of geographic background we're coming from. Up here in Boundary County, we have basically like a wet Mediterranean climate. It's a lot different from the rest of the state. We're more similar in our climate and soils to like interior British Columbia than we are most of the rest of Idaho. Or we might be more similar to like a higher elevation within some of the rest of Idaho. Okay, so looks like looks like a lot of places that are more arid than where where I am right now. I'm seeing, oh, we have somebody from Maine. Well, there we go. There's the exact inverse. There's someone who's probably a lot wetter than where we are. Oh, I used to live in Salmon, so I'm familiar with Dillon and Salmon. And I used to live in the Magic Valley too, so I'm a rare Gooding County appreciator. Um, cool. Well, so some my references to North Idaho stuff probably won't apply to you guys super well, but mo most of the concepts we'll talk about will still work for you guys. So I apologize for a little bit of the Boundary County focus here, but ultimately that is my job to serve my county, and then I'm also happy to give stuff for the rest of the state. Um, anyway, without further ado, let's go ahead and move on here. So this is a little plug I like to give in a lot of the classes I teach, but we in the University of Idaho have sort of like an alarm system for pests that are coming into the state. This is called Pacific Northwest Pest Alerts. Right now, it's geared mostly towards like large scale ag. We're kind of starting to put garden stuff in there. I'd like to start using it for forestry pests and that kind of stuff too. Um, if you're in North Idaho, which it looks like none of you guys are except for this one person from Cottonwood in the Panhandle, then you'll be getting alerts from me. Different people post them in the rest of the state, and there is one, I think they do post them for Malheur County, Oregon as well. Um, Anyway, this is a good thing to sign up on just to be aware of different things that are moving through the area, whether it's, being able to identify a pest, whether it's in your yard or garden, maybe being able to alert others in your area to potentially kind of slow the spread of certain things moving into the state or a general area. Um, for instance, I'm actually an entomologist by training, even though I have a lot of other, diverse interests. And we're kind of like keeping an eye on the emerald ash borer, keeping an eye on the spotted lanternfly. So this is a way that we can alert you guys in a, well reviewed scientific way that there's something showing up in our state. So you guys can be aware of that and act accordingly if you see it pop up in your property. So I believe Eric popped that in the chat somewhere above your guys's popping in with where you're at. So once again, recommend signing up for that. Um, so moving on, talking a little bit about this talk. So once again, I am an agricultural extension agent. I don't have any kind of natural resource appointment. So what am I doing on a natural resource webinar? Well, I have just a huge love for native plants. I'm a massive botany nerd. I've been pretty heavily involved with the Idaho Native Plant Society for the last 5 or 6 years. I used to be the president of the Twin Falls chapter. This picture is me on I saw one of you guys is in McCall on the Valley County High Point Big Baldy where we did a survey of alpine flora last year. I've been really interested in like collecting seed and propagating native plants since I was a kid. So I've always been doing that, for most of my life with limited success. And well, if there's one thing I've learned in trying to grow native plants, it's to be patient and to keep your expectations not too low or not too high because they're not garden vegetables. Sometimes they don't have the germination rates that we'd like to see. And then sometimes you're expecting them to do terribly and then they do awesome. So um it's kind of the Wild West in terms of growing plants. I've also kind of been involved with this Canadian Native Plant Society a little bit. I'd like to get more involved with that, but that's not really relevant to any of you guys because you guys are all way to the south of me. I think my closest person here is in Cottonwood. And then I'll probably use this as a little bit of a reference. I'm doing a camas propagation project up here in collaboration with the Kootenai tribe of Idaho. A lot of people don't realize that we have a tribe that's located entirely within Boundary County, within the state of Idaho. They extend into Montana and Canada as well, historically as well as in the present. But we're kind of at the marginal, we're at the end of the range of camas. And if you don't know what camas is, it's a flowering plant currently in the asparagus family, but it kind of, the plant looks more of like what you think of as like a lily type thing. It's got kind of like um almost like onion-esque bulb that is the edible part, and it's kind of like a starchy root vegetable that used to be a really important staple crop for a lot of the tribes in Western North America in general. Oops, sorry. And like I said, where I'm at in the pretty far north part of the state is kind of right at the marginal edge of the distribution, and cannabis is quite rare in my area. So I got this idea to first of all collect some native plant seed to first of all preserve some of our local genetics here, because we don't have that many existing populations, and then to also start working with the tribe to get it back in their tribal land in the modern day, as well as just doing some really basic trials. I'm just looking at comparing indoor stratification versus direct sowing outside. It's stuff that other people have done ad nauseum with this plant. I'm just kind of doing it with some of our locally sourced seed here because where it grows here is quite different than how it grows in a lot of the rest of its range. And a lot of other areas, it's a wetland plant. Here it tends to be more of like an understory or even like upland plant, which is kind of interesting. Anyway, so I'll probably use that Canvas project for just as a case study in some of the general propagation stuff I'm talking about, just because it's fresh in my mind. All right, getting into the actual class. So starting off with what is even a native plant? And that maybe you'd think that's intuitive, but it's actually there isn't always necessarily a straight answer to that. Sort of the most commonly used definition is it's a plant endemic to North America prior to human, especially like Europeans, like the last, several centuries colonization. There were probably a lot of plants that were brought over when the Native Americans first came here over the Bering Strait or wherever they first came from, but it's a little bit harder to tell, which one of those were originally North American and which originally came from, like Eurasia or wherever. Um, so those wherever those are generally counted as just native plants. When we're thinking about like a propagation perspective, I think of native as being from as close to the area that you're looking to plant as possible. So like not even just the right species, but hopefully like a local biotype, local population source. To me, that's the gold standard for native plant propagation. Different people have different standards on that as well in terms of like how local is good enough. So this is just a little bit of case study on this. This is a Canadian bunchberry. I believe I took this picture in Maine, actually. One of you guys, I believe, is from Maine. And I have a slide on this later, but this is actually a plant that exists from here, like here in Idaho, all the way across to the eastern United States. So it's got something called a boreomontane distribution where it lives both in like northern latitudes as well as high elevations. Um, so I mean, even though this is a plant that is native to Idaho, I don't necessarily know if this exact individual plant would be the best place to collect seed from when it's growing in Maine. You know what I mean? Because it's locally adapted to a totally different set of rainfall, wind patterns, maybe even like day length type things, temperature. So that's just an example of you know, what I kind of think the ideal is for selecting seed for planting in an area that you're trying to grow stuff. I think as close as you can get as possible, the better. So this is just a little example. You guys, I'm sure, maybe with the exception of the person from Maine, have all seen a mullein before, right? So here's a question: true or false? Is a mullein a native plant or not? Just throw it in the chat there, and just give it your best guess, or whatever you would intuitively think. Yeah, and I'm seeing, this crowd is probably a little bit more in tune to this than the general population, but generally we would consider mullein a non-native plant because it's not native to North America. It was introduced with European colonization. It was probably one of the earlier plants that came along with that. Um, a lot of people think it's native because a lot of the Native Americans apparently used it as a medicinal plant as well as A lot of people today like to use it in a medicinal plant, and I'm sure in its native range in Europe, it probably was used that way as well. But it's still not native to North America. And this can point out that non-native is not always bad per se. And, like what you want in terms of, this is more like restoration focused, but in your own property is a little bit up to you, right? In terms of like what your goals are for restoration or what your personal preferences for like how local you want to go with collecting or planting different species of plants. Um, but just keep in mind, some of the things that people think are native are also not native because oftentimes, people are often shocked when I tell them that mullein is not native. But a lot of you guys seem to actually know that it was not, which is also gives me a little bit of information about your guys' kind of general level of knowledge, which is good. Okay, so this is where I was this on the right, I believe, is an expert from the consortium of Pacific Northwest Herbaria, but this shows the map of Canadian bunchberry. So you can see how it goes all the way from like Quebec all the way down to California. So this is just an example of, you probably aren't going to want to use a seed collected from a Californian bunchberry to grow in Quebec, right? Like it might grow fine, but at least to me, it makes sense to get as local as possible, not only because it's going to theoretically grow better when you get locally adapted genetics, but also preserves the genetics of that local population. Like you can order seeds from a lot of different native plant seeds species, but who knows where those genetics are coming from? And if that species is present in your area, maybe you're even like introducing some of those genes from like some wildly different population that could, you know, maybe kind of mess up the local gene pool a little bit. Um, these are kind of just a lot of my own personal philosophy and thoughts. So once again, a lot of this is ultimately up to you. But generally, in my opinion, you should try to get as local seed source or plant sources as possible to A, preserve genetics, as well as B, get a theoretically better performing plant. Increase vigor is how I described it on here. Um, so one of the other reasons that you might want to plant native plants from seeds is that not every plant is something that you can just order online or like go buy at a native plant nursery. Some things, you actually have to go out in the wild and collect seed from it to actually get some on your property yourself. So that's another thing there. And there's a lot of like experimenting that you can do. Like native plants vary widely in terms of how much research has been done on how to propagate them. Like for instance, Camas has a lot of research done on it. A lot of native plants don't, so you generally have to do a little bit of like playing around to find the best methods that work for the plant species in general, maybe your local populations. Um, Another reason here, which this is me kind of throwing in some of my thoughts as an entomologist, but planting native plants is also a great way to support local insect populations. This is a picture of a gall from southern Idaho. I don't remember exactly where I took this, but everyone talks about pollinators when it comes to preserving insects, and that's very important for sure. But one thing a lot of people forget about is that a lot of native insects are plant feeding, right? And a lot of those plant feeding insects are restricted to a pretty short list of plant hosts. And if those plants don't exist in the landscape, those insects, go extinct. And there's a lot of talk, maybe you guys have heard about like the insect apocalypse and a lot of that a lot of different insect species are going extinct. And to me, that's kind of like a no-brainer because we're eliminating so much of their habitat. So by planting native plants, you are theoretically conserving native insect populations, not just the pollinators, but like the whole ecosystem of insects that rely on that plant for their life cycle. Galls are a great example of that. A gall is a plant structure that an insect induces the plant to create so that it can live inside of it. And they can be created by all different kinds of insects, but they're usually species specific to both the host plant as well as the gall inducer. And they usually have like a whole community of other insects associated with them. So there's parasites of that gall maker. There's other species of insects that may only be able to live in that gall. They call those inquilines. So it's just something to think about. this isn't something that's really talked a lot about, the sort of value of planting native plants to preserve just like kind of the general native insect population. But in my opinion, planting native plants is probably the best way that um, the average person can promote insect conservation, especially locally sourced native plants that will provide a better host resource for some of those local insects. So just talking a little bit about growing native plants in general. So native native plants in my mind are sort of like kind of a long game kind of thing. They can be hard to get established, but oftentimes once you get them established, they're a lot easier to take care of than, your typical introduced ornamentals. Um, so once again, you kind of have to have a little bit of patience in that. Um, Once again, a lot of the seeds of native plants require special treatments to break dormancy and actually have them grow. And I kind of touched on this as well, but certain species of native plants have a lot of resources on how to grow them, and some don't. So usually when I have grown native plants, I end up doing like a little bit of experimenting or playing with this kind of scarification or this kind of stratification or whatnot. So just be prepared for that. Be prepared that it might be a little bit more of a Wild West kind of experience than going to the hardware store and picking up a Marigold. Not that I think the people on this call necessarily would expect that. And once again, I'm kind of normally only talking to just general gardeners. Um, so be patient is kind of the name of the game. And once again, this is just another kind of local thing, but probably some of the best benefits in terms of preserving local native plant genetics as well as local insect populations are in areas where there are not already a lot of native plants growing. Up here in North Idaho, a lot of people's properties still have a lot of like relatively intact forest habitat and might even be like majority native, which is not normal at all for like uh, probably a lot of the world, but definitely, a lot of the rest of the state. Like in southern Idaho, you'd be hard pressed to find too many native plants on the average homeowner's property, especially in dense urban areas like Boise. Anyway, and this is just once again a local thing I want to throw out that a lot of people here probably wouldn't think that there is value in saving seed from like the Oregon grape growing in their backyard, but in my opinion, there is a lot of value to that because that could be a different sort of genetic seed stock than the Oregon grape growing up in the national forests, 3,000 feet above town, even if it's the same species. So, yeah, once again, I don't know how much native plants are common in your guys's landscapes wherever you are, but pretty common here, which is actually really cool. And this is a picture of my home garden. All right, so we're gonna get a little bit into species and site selection. So a lot of people ask me what the best way to identify plants is. In our area, this is probably the best field guide for the layman, in my opinion. This book, Plants of Southern Interior British Columbia and Inland Northwest. I'm sure those of you who are into plants and live in the northern half of the state have probably seen this book and probably used it once or twice. There are other field guides that work better for other parts of the state. There's even a version of this, I believe, just for the Rocky Mountains in general that I want to say I've used in Southern Idaho. Um, a lot of you guys have probably seen this book, and this is kind of the gold standard for plant identification across most of Idaho. It's a dichotomous key, so it's got a lot of advanced terminology. It's a little bit intimidating to use for the first time if you've never keyed things before. But if you really want to identify a plant correctly, which is important if you're saving native plant seeds from the wild, this is what you should use, in my opinion. A lot of people ask me about the AI plant identification apps. I'm personally not a huge fan of them. They definitely work better for plants than they do for insects, but they do tend to have a margin of error to them. And it seems like the people in this chat probably have a little bit of botany knowledge on them. So you guys know about a few of you probably know about kind of the nuance that comes to identifying certain plants, um, where you might not even be able to identify them as species unless you dig up the root or like dissect out the flower or something like that. So those apps, in my opinion, are just a little bit too prone to false negatives and false positives and whatnot. Use as many different sources as you can when you're identifying a plant. I think that's the best way to go. But in my opinion, if you are comfortable using this book, this is where I would start if you're out in the field and identifying a plant to save seed from, which I would absolutely do because you want to know what it is that you're saving seed from so that, you can keep those notes in your records. If you're ever going to share them with other people, they actually know what they're getting, etc. So this is moving on into kind of like, okay, so you have your property and you're thinking about what kind of plants should I plant on this property? Let's say you live in Ontario, Oregon. All right. So you're in the middle of this kind of like urban, suburban area. There's a lot of fields around you. You can maybe extrapolate from that BLM land, that like patch of desert that's 30 miles away, but you're not entirely sure what actually grew on your plot of land in the past. There can be a lot of variation in plant community based off of soil type, based off of microclimate. And, oftentimes it's impossible to tell exactly what was growing there pre-colonization, without some kind of time machine. But one cool tool is this web soil survey, which is developed by NRCS, Natural Resource Conservation Service. It's a branch of USDA, and it's a wealth of knowledge. If you're interested in soils or agriculture or natural resources at all, I highly recommend playing with it. Unfortunately, it looks like it's older than me. The UI is fairly janky, and it's a little bit of a learning curve. But one of the many things that this can do is that you can actually go to your property and draw like a little box around it, and it'll give you all of the different soil types that you have, and you can click on those and pull from like this long list of different data sources, and one of those will actually tell you some of the common native plants that probably grew there pre-colonization based off of the soil type that soil had. So this was a random field in Boundary County that I drew. It's been heavily modified for well over a century, most likely. But, the plants that it recommended are almost certainly pretty, or probably actually growing there based off of what I know about nearby habitat. So recommended Clintonia uniflora, the bead lily, western hemlock, wild ginger, etc. Most of my family lives in Boise, and I've actually used this to select native plant species to plant on some of their properties in terms of what might work best for their soils. And it is also like historical soils, so there's a lot of like soil disturbance and stuff. But once again, it's kind of trying to match it also for those insect communities that might have been there historically to theoretically kind of bring them back. That's one of the reasons that I think that looking at this kind of stuff has some value. Um, iNaturalist can be an interesting tool. This to me, iNaturalist isn't an identification tool. So it has an AI thing built into it. You can post pictures on it, and other people can come in and place IDs on pictures that people post. For me, I mostly use it for checking the ranges of things, and keep in mind that there's a margin of error with this. But this is kind of like something to compare. Where I'm like, okay, I'm doing this project with camas. I wonder where camas is growing in the Western United States or North America. And you can see that it's pretty common throughout most of Idaho, but there's kind of this giant blob in the very northern part of the state where I am, which is, the official Pacific Northwest herbarium records show kind of the same patterns. You can cross-reference them. But this can be another thing to be like, okay, this is kind of a guesstimate of where this plant is actually growing. And if you'll see things labeled as native in um certain native plant nurseries or certain stores, and then you look it up and it's like, oh wow, this actually doesn't grow within like 100-mile radius of me. So this can just be like a quick and dirty way to kind of like assess whether or not this is actually like a good fit for your area. This is another kind of interesting thing that I have not personally used too much, but this is another USDA tool where you can actually break down all of the United States into these seed zones that work kind of similarly to the USDA growing zones, in that they show the best areas to collect seed from and then plant seed from. And I believe it's based off of some combination of like temperature. I'm not sure if it's based off of like summer highs or winter lows or whatever. But theoretically, you would look at the colors on this map, see what color your property is in, and then collect seed from within the same color, preferably nearby. And to me, a lot of this is, it's kind of intuitive what's sort of in the same microclimate. But if you're a little bit unsure on that, maybe you're new to the area, I think that this could be a good tool. And like I said, I haven't played around with it too much. And I'll send out the slides to Eric. I'm not sure if there's a mailing list for this webinar. But you can also just Google, I believe it's probably this. I think if you type in USFS seed zone collecting map, it should pop up on Google. Just touching on legality of seed collection, you are allowed to collect small amounts of seed on most public land, including Forest Service and BLM, as far as I know. I've actually checked on this with Forest Service, and that's what they told me. I haven't actually called BLM and asked them what their official regulations are. I've just been told by a lot of people that you can officially that you can collect small quantities of seed on that land. If you're going to collect a large amount of seed stock, then you generally will require a permit. In my experience, if you're doing some kind of small scale restoration permit project, these entities are usually pretty willing to work with you on that kind of stuff. Different types of public land outside of Forest Service and BLM, for instance, Fish and Game, which is what IDFG is, Army Corps of Engineers, which manages a lot of areas around dams and whatnot. They'll typically require an actual permit. A lot of this, people probably won't know if you go collect native plant seed most of the time, but this is what you're supposed to do. And then of course private, it's, you're always supposed to collect permission once again, or you're always supposed to ask permission from somebody before you go on their property and collect any kind of seed. So make sure that you're not breaking in anywhere and just grabbing wildflower seeds willy-nilly. Touching on a few more resources. So these are a few, if you actually, instead of like collecting seed, you want to actually like go out and just buy seed packets. Snake River Seed is a cool company. They do a lot of garden seeds. They have a smaller list of native plant options available. But they're pretty cool. I know some of the people that work there. I'm sure a lot of people on this call I bought from them before. Um, this Native Ideals is out of Montana, so if you're in the northern half of Idaho or maybe even McCall, this is probably some pretty decently locally sourced seed source for you. And they have a pretty wide variety of common like understory wildflower type stuff. This is just camas once again because I love camas, but they have a lot of the other common like wildflower species out there too. And I think they might be a newer company, so I highly recommend checking them out. They're called Native Ideals. They also have this like beautiful seed packet art, which is always cool to see. This is super local. Nobody here's from North Idaho, so I'm actually just gonna skip over this. Hopefully you have a native plant nursery near you. I know that there is or was one in McCall. There's a few in Boise. There's one in Twin Falls. There is that one forgetting the name of it. There's one North Fork something something that kind of specializes in like wetland sod out there in East Idaho. East Idaho is kind of the only part of the state I've never lived in, so I'm not as sure what kind of nurseries are out there. Um, but sorry. Hopefully you guys got something. This is another local. We have a native plant society in Sandpoint. Probably not super relevant to any of you guys. Moving on to propagation protocols, a lot of different entities create propagation protocols. Forest Service creates a lot of propagation protocols. Universities will create them sometimes. There's several databases out there. I have a common one linked in the next slide. Um, when I'm looking for propagation protocols, I usually try to find as many as I can and kind of create like a census, like a consensus between all of them, because a lot of times they'll all say something kind of like slightly different. And of course, I'll also try to find propagation protocols that are created by people who are like relatively close to me and they're working with some of the same theoretical seed stock, maybe some of the same environmental conditions, etc. And this is just an example of kind of some of the things that you'll see. A lot of these protocols are kind of designed for nurseries. So if you're doing them on more of like a homeowner scale, you might kind of have to like scale down or guesstimate some of this stuff. Um, but usually it'll kind of be like a table. They'll have like a long list of different growing recommendations. This is a pretty awesome uh, database of native plant propagation protocols. It's got 3,000 different um, species in there. I've used this a good amount. I remember Lauren saying that there was one source that they preferred for the University of Idaho nursery. I don't know. Do you have a preferred protocol repository, Eric?
No, that would definitely, yeah, that would be a Lauren or maybe a Tim Prather question. Yeah.
For sure. Well, there's a lot out there, and like I said, try to find as many protocols for your species as possible, and then compare and contrast and see how many of them agree with each other and what you think makes the most sense. And once again, with native plants, a lot of times you are kind of playing detective a little bit, and this is an example of that. Um, so first of all, when you think about propagating a native plant, think about the environmental scenario that that plant is growing in the wild. Like what kind of environmental conditions, what kind of soil conditions is it encountering in its native habitat? So this is not a native plant in North America, but this is just a weird plant that I'm experimenting with in my garden this year. It's got a bunch of common names: jute mallow, malokia. It's a leafy vegetable that grows in Africa, but you can buy them from this Baker Creek seed company that I'm sure probably a lot of you have heard of. And when you look at the recommendations for how to grow it on the back, it says that you should cold stratify this plant for, I believe, 2 months. And I was looking at that and I was like, huh, this is a tropical plant. And I believe that this cultivar is actually from Cameroon, which is like, I think it's like right on the equator. I was like, that seems kind of fishy to me. And then I looked up a few more protocols, and literally none of them mention cold stratification at all. In fact, a lot of them recommended hot water scarification specifically. And so this on the left is what I ended up doing. There's not a lot of seeds in this packet, but the seed flat on the left was mechanical scarification, and the one on the right was hot water scarification. Did not stratify at all, and got pretty good germination rates with the hot water treatment. Because once again, I didn't plant that many seeds, and in the hot water treatment, almost all the seeds actually germinated. So this is just an example of like take a step back, kind of think about the biology of the plant that you're trying to grow, and look at multiple sources to get as much information as possible because once again, how to grow these plants isn't always as well worked out as a lot of our commonly propagated like vegetables and flowers that a lot of people might be more familiar with growing. All right, so getting into a little bit of seed collecting and saving. So just a little bit in terms of the ethics of native plant seeds, collecting native plant seeds. There's not necessarily like a strict thing. It's like this is how you should collect native plant seeds, but just keep in mind like how common is the species that you're collecting from both locally and in general? Like, is it a rare plant? Should you collect seeds from it at all? Um, Make sure that when you're out there, you're not damaging the habitat of that plant. You're not tracking in a bunch of like weed seeds if you've been in an area that has a lot of noxious weeds or something like that. When I did my camas project, I decided to only sample from about 1/3 of the individual plants in the various patches of camas that I was collecting from, just so that I wasn't like totally wiping out the seed bank of that plant. That's just an example of keeping in mind that you want to make sure that you're not preventing this plant from reproducing in the wild, right? Like you don't want to go and just take all its seeds at one place, especially if it's kind of a rare plant, even just in your area. So we're going to talk a little bit about seed saving in general. If you guys have done any seed saving in your garden, it is a lot of the techniques for garden vegetables will also work for native plants. Um, so we're going to compare dry seed processing versus wet seed processing. And before that, labeling is super important. Before you process your seeds at all, you've gone and collected seeds out from the wild. Always, always, always label. You do not want to be playing seed detective back at your house with a bunch of bags of unlabeled seeds. This information, in my opinion, is the bare minimum. Date, the species of plant, or your best guess. The location you collected them, ideally with GPS coordinates, who collected them, and you can go way more in depth with all kinds of details about your collection point. But this is the bare minimum. Probably date, species, and location at the very, very least, always when you're collecting native plant seed. So when's the best time to collect dry seeds? So these are seeds that are generally propagated by just kind of breaking open and either, spreading out in the wind, hitching a ride on an animal, not being eaten by something usually. Those are going to be your wet seeds. So probably, honestly, most plants have dry seeds, right? And sometimes it's a little hard to tell when a fruit is ripe, which means generally when a fruit is ripe, that means that those seeds are mature. So a lot of times with these native plants, once again, this requires a little bit of planning, sometimes years in advance. You might have to actually watch your plant of interest go through its life cycle for a full year, especially if it's something that there's not a lot of data about it, to see when those fruits are maturing, when they might be breaking apart and scattering, because you don't want to go out to collect seed too late or too early, right? Because if you're too early, and a lot of times, the seed pods or whatever kind of fruit that they have might still be a little bit greenish or something like that. Um, then those seeds might not be mature yet, right? And you might either not get any germination or get very, very poor mature germination rates. And then, some of these fruit just, they dehisce their seeds like that, like they might be gone in a couple of days. So you don't want to collect too late and show up at your plant where you want to collect seed and there's no seed left on it. So this is a balancing act. It requires, once again, a good amount of pre-planning. Um, sorry, and I'm running a little low on time here, so I'm going to kind of speed through some of this. Um, Sometimes you'll need to actually crush up the fruit to remove the seeds. There's all kind of ways you can do that. You can pull them apart by hand. You can use an old blender. You can step on the seeds. Um, this is just for fun. The term that you use for separating out those seeds from the rest of the fruit is called threshing. It's just an old-fashioned ag term. Don't really need to know that. After you thresh, you're going to want to winnow. So you can just pour that mix of like like fruit residue and seeds like over a fan. Um, and like the bad seed will like blow out and you'll be able to separate out like the bad seeds should blow all the like fruit material should blow further away, and then like the good stuff should drop like kind of straight down because it's heavier than the than that kind of like loose chaffy stuff. So wet seeds, this is another example of you might have to kind of watch your plant and know when it's ripening, when it's ready to harvest. Maybe watch when in the season they kind of disappear. If it's a wet fruit that is typically eaten by animals relatively quickly. Um, a lot of times it's good to ferment these seeds. You don't absolutely have to do this. A lot of people will just kind of pull them out by hand, but this is something that I usually do when I'm propagating wet native plant seeds. And I'm not going to go too into detail on this. There's guides you can look on up for fermenting seeds all over the place online. Um, so I'm going to skip through that. Generally, seed storage, cool, dark, dry place. try to plant your native plant seeds within a year if possible. A lot of times with native plants, you won't be able to Google like, oh, this seed will be viable for X amount of years. So just assume that you should use it relatively quickly is my general guideline. And once again, label, label, label. Be better at it than me. Like I just wrote the species and the date on this one, which is not best practices for seed saving. But it's better than nothing. It's better than having a bag of unlabeled seed. All right, so getting into kind of the propagation stuff. So once again, a lot of native plant seeds have something called seed coat dormancy. So if you just throw them in the ground, they're probably not going to grow or they're going to have a very low germination rate. So we're going to have to do sometimes a series of different processes to break that seed coat dormancy. A lot of times in the wild, these are mechanisms to ensure that the seeds don't germinate before they're meant to, like maybe before winter is over. They might need to pass through the gut of the animal. Maybe they need to be exposed to like a flash flood or summer temperatures or whatever it is that this species needs to experience to make sure that it's growing at the right time. So the two main sort of things that we generally need to do to break seed dormancy are scarification and stratification. Scarification is wearing down or damaging the seed coat. Stratification is exposing the seed to a certain temperature, generally cold in our area, but warm stratification also exists to break dormancy. A lot of native plants require both of these. So we're going to touch on scarification a little bit here. So scarification is intentionally damaging the seed coat to induce germination. Um, it generally mimics natural processes like digestion in an animal gut, like I said, or abrasion from rocks and flood water, or some other process where this seed coat would get damaged in the wild. There's two main methods of scarification, acid scarification and mechanical scarification. And this is another area where, look at your protocol and keep in mind like the biology of the plant that you're harvesting. A lot of plant propagation protocols will be like, okay, chemical or mechanical scarify this. But if it's a wet fruit that is designed to be dispersed by animals, maybe it might actually make more sense to try acid scarifying that, or try a couple different treatments, which I will often do if I'm propagating a native plant for the first time. I'll try several different methods of scarification and or stratification. Um, and then if it's like a dry seed, maybe it doesn't make sense to acid scarify because, a plant that just kind of breaks open and spreads its seeds through the wind or whatever, probably not going to be exposed to kind of acidic conditions in the wild. Um, so when you look at a lot of these native plant propagation protocols, a lot of times they'll recommend you actually use sulfuric acid, which you can buy as just kind of a general person off the internet. Other types of acid will probably suffice. There's all sorts of different like products out there that people will use for acid scarification. Um, but once again, the protocols will generally be for sulfuric acid. If you're using any of these kind of like concentrated intense acids, make sure that you're looking at the safety data sheet or the label of that acid before you're even thinking about using it. Make sure you have the right PPE. You're generally not going to want to get any of that on your skin. You're not going to want any of it on your eyes. You're probably going to want to neutralize it with some kind of base at some point. All of that will be on the label and oftentimes in the protocol as well. Some other things that people use, Coca-Cola is, if you've ever looked at like a pH like diagram, is like shockingly acidic. And some people actually do use it to scarify seeds. I've read a couple papers and, probably unsurprisingly, they generally show that it doesn't perform nearly as well as some of these other things like sulfuric or acetic acid. If you do it in something like Coca-Cola, I would probably leave it in the scarification for a lot longer than you would if you're using a more concentrated acid like sulfuric or acetic. Generally the sulfuric or acetic acid recommendations are going to be like, okay, throw your seeds in the acid for like 10 minutes or something like that. And then, do a few washes to get the acid off before you plant them or stratify them or whatever. For the Coca-Cola, you might want to leave it in there overnight or something like that if you're even going to mess with that. I've used acetic acid, glacial acetic acid, which is basically pure vinegar with no water added into it as a substitute for sulfuric acid. And in my experience, it's worked okay. I usually don't see it on protocols. I happen to have some on hand for my entomology work, but once again, the idea is that you need to expose it to an acidic environment as well as break down that seed coat. I think, irregardless of, I often suspect that some of these plants that require acid scarification, it's not just damaging the seed coat. The pH might also have some effect in terms of breaking the dormancy, but we don't always know that. That's one of the reasons that, once again, trying a few of these different scarification methods might be good because you might, once again, it might not just be that you need to weaken the seed coat. Maybe you also need to actually have it be at a certain pH to really break that dormancy properly. And once again, the length you're soaking the acid varies widely. It could be 10 minutes, could be 30 minutes, could be several hours, could be a day or two. Generally going to want to do a few washes, neutralize it with baking soda so that it's not just like sitting in the acid forever. Um, this is just an example. You can buy sulfuric acid for like 26 bucks off Amazon. Um, Mechanical scarification, and Eric, just stop me if I'm going over time here. I don't have too much more in the talk after this, but this is physically damaging the seed coat. So a lot of people, when they're growing plant seeds, it's kind of hard to be like, okay, I'm gonna like mess up my seed, but you really want to get kind of rough with them here. One technique you can use is get some like hard like high grit sandpaper and just get those seeds and just rub the seeds together with two pieces of sandpaper so that you're abrading that seed coat. I have literally taken an X-Acto knife or even a kitchen knife, and I actually did this with some of the plants I was growing this season, and just literally cut the seed coat open. And sometimes those it's obvious there's like kind of this really hard outer layer, and then you'll see that like kind of softer seed inside of it. Usually those will not germinate at all unless you break through that really hard seed coat. A lot of people who are in, kind of the larger scale plant propagation, maybe they have a nursery, they like to use a dull blender for this. So it's, maybe not going to be so hard that's messing up the seeds too much, but it's just, you can throw a bunch of seeds in there and scarify them up, like in large batches. So I heard one native plant nursery guy say that he sometimes raids garage sales to find old blenders to use specifically for this purpose. Another form of mechanical scarification is hot water scarification. And this is one of those things that, once again, it's probably a little bit scary to do to your seeds for the first time, but generally it's going to be some variation of boiling water and throwing your seeds in there for a short period of time. In my experience, I've usually the protocol is generally recommended that I do it for 5 to 10 minutes. I'm sure that there's probably a lot of variation in that too. This is just a paper that I found right before this talk, actually. This Iliamna rivularius, I can't remember the common name of that, but I think it's like wild hollyhock. It's widespread throughout the intermontane West. But it's an example of a wild flower that apparently, if you hot water scarify it, it works a lot better than mechanical scarification. So if you see mechanical scarification on a protocol, this, even if it doesn't say hot water scarification, this could be something to play with. I'm sure there are probably plants that can potentially be damaged by super high temperatures, but once again, that can just be something that you play with a little bit. But a lot of protocols will actually say to hot water scarify as a possible option for scarification. And if you are processing any sort of large amounts of seeds, it's so much nicer to be able to just throw a bunch of seeds in boiling water than it is to go through with like a kitchen or X-Acto knife or even sandpaper, right? Moving on to stratification, this is exposing seeds to a certain temperature to break that dormancy. There's two main kinds, cold and warm. Cold is generally around 33 to 42 degrees Fahrenheit. Generally, you don't want to throw native plant seeds in. You don't want to throw plant seeds in the freezer. A lot of plants can survive being frozen, but there's a good chance that it could cause some degree of mortality or reduced vigor in your seed stock. So you want it kind of just above freezing or kind of just like coolish. A refrigerator is usually good. A cold garage sometimes can work just fine. Warm stratification is less common. It's usually going to be used in concert with cold stratification. So like maybe it's kind of simulating going through winter and then coming out into spring. So that could just be like, you throw it in the fridge and then take it out and expose it to room temperature for a certain amount of time. But I haven't encountered warm stratification too much in my history of growing native plants. So cold moist stratification is the most common kind of cold stratification. So you're going to want to start with sterile media, which is true for seed starting in general. You don't want to introduce a bunch of like fungi or bacteria that are going to cause like root rot or dampening off when you're propagating plants. Um, the medium, you can kind of play around with that too. I personally generally just like to stratify in whatever medium that I'm planning to start those plants in. So a lot of time I will just use like either sand or even just like a seed starting mix. That's what I'm using for my camas right now. Some people just literally throw them in a bag, like just a bag with no media at all, or maybe just like a wet paper towel, and then plant them after they start to germinate in that bag. I think that requires a little bit more monitoring. And a sealed bag is a little bit more prone to mold, which is going to be your enemy when it comes to cold moist stratification. I'll give you a warning there right now. So I personally like to do this just in like a flat, like a seed starting tray. But once again, you can kind of do it in whatever media that you want. So once you have your seeds in whatever you're going to stratify it in, your protocol will tell you to do it for X amount of weeks. For my camas, I think I did it for 3 months. Bear grass, if you're from, the high, if you've seen that in the higher elevation areas, that has like a 7 or 8 month stratification period, and a lot of those alpine plants will have a longer stratification period than a lower elevation species would. Um, and if you're trying to go out for something that has no information or no available protocols, maybe look at like how long the growing season or how long the winter might be at that elevation where you collected it and use that to estimate what the stratification period is. And if it's for a high elevation area, like I mean, I would stratify it honestly, even if like if you're go cold and just like trying to grow something that people don't really grow, like I would assume that it's something that usually in my experience, native plants require cold stratification to some extent. Um, so this is just an example of what that can look like. Labeling is super important when it comes to this. You do not want to throw a bag or a flat in your fridge and then be playing guess what seed that is in like 3 months, right? Super easy to do that and forget about it. These are just a few setups that you can do. You can use a sand perlite mix. Once again, you can put some of like sand perlite in a bag or something like that. There's all kind of ways that you can use different media or different setups for this stratification. The important thing is just to expose it to moisture and temperature. And label, 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 super important. Some plants just require temperature exposure instead of both temperature and moisture exposure. Um, and those are a lot easier. You can usually just throw them in like whatever you collected the seed in, whether it's the jar or the packet, and leave them in there for that amount of time. Warm stratification, I already touched on that. The only thing that requires warm stratification that I've ever messed with is kinnikinnick. It requires both cold stratification and warm stratification. And all that I did for that is take it out of the fridge and put it like on a counter for I think a month or something like that. Maybe there's other things that require like maybe a higher temperature, and you can find whatever high temperature area that you have and use that for your warm stratification. I'm going to skip through this because I think I'm over time. Um, so this was originally a workshop where we actually went through and actually practiced some of these techniques of scarification and stratification. I love Kinnick because it requires like all of the things. Like it's a, I mean, it's kind of like a dry, wet fruit, but it's a fruit that requires, it's meant to be eaten by animals. So it's best acid or mechanical scarified. So you can do both and compare which works better. I did an acetic acid bath when we did it in like the workshop. It requires cold stratification, it requires warm stratification. It's not that hard to grow despite all of that. So once again, it's a great thing to just play with if you want to, this is a pretty common plant throughout the state, in intermontane west, and it's another boreal montane. Even our friend, if you're still in the call from Maine, I believe this grows all the way out there. So everyone should have something to play around with it if you want to practice with any of these techniques. And this is just the protocol. I'm not going to go through all that. And this was just an example of something that this is the bead lily Clintonia uniflora. I'm sure most of you guys on this call have seen either this plant or one of its close relatives. There's not a ton of information available on propagating this plant that I could find. Most of the stuff that protocols that I found said that it was hard to propagate. And I noticed that it has kind of like a wet fruit. I don't know anything about the biology of this species, but it almost has like a berry. And I noticed that the protocols didn't necessarily say to acid scarify, but this is one of those things I was like, maybe that's something to play with, where maybe acid scarifying this could potentially increase germination rates. Um, and maybe that's why people don't get good germination when they've tried it in the past. Anyway, so just kind of to recap, this is the last slide before a big resource um, resource dump of different informational things about native plant propagation. Some things to ask yourself when you're going out in the wild collecting native plant seed is like, what do you know about the biology of that plant? What kind of soils is it growing in? What kind of temperatures is it being exposed to? Is it being dispersed by animals or insects in any way? And like, how can you replicate all of those things in your controlled environment when you're trying to propagate it? How much moisture was it collected that was in the habitat when you collected it? That might kind of inform whether you want to like cold stratify it or cold moist stratify it. Um, is there a if you're once again, if you're going for something that hasn't really been propagated much, is there a closely related species that you can maybe kind of borrow some propagation techniques, which isn't always necessarily going to work for the one that you're working on, but it could be a starting point, in your plant detective journey. Um, and this is a long list of resources. A lot of them I talked to. Um, I like I said, I believe that I can send you guys these slides, but feel free to take a screenshot of this. And I'll leave this on as the last slide. And sorry if I'm a little bit scatterbrained. I just got back from like 3 weeks of vacation, so yeah,
No,
probably a little bit
appreciate it.
more all over the place in this talk than I normally would be. But happy to take any questions right now if
Yeah,
anybody's
really
got them.
appreciate it, Samuel. And we are recording these webinars, and we'll put the recordings on our YouTube channel. I threw that into the chat earlier, and I'll send out a message to the list when the recording's ready, and I can include these references in that email too, if you'd like. Um, we do have a couple of questions. One from Trish. Does growing native plants that support native insect communities prevent pest issues? And that interest is particularly around the hobby farm context. What do you think?
Yeah. It's one of those things like so many different things in ecology and horticulture. It's really impossible to give a one size fits all answer to a question like that, because it's going to be really site and context dependent. But in general, theoretically, planting native plant species should encourage kind of like a general better insect population in general. And a lot of pest species are controlled by native predators that are also feeding on native insects. So if you have a good stock of those native predators, which might be encouraged by planting native plants, those could also help control with some of your pest species, which the vast majority of pest species are invasive. There are a couple native ones, but those are definitely the exception rather than the rule. Um, and it's really hard to measure the effects of those things too. So my answer would be hopefully yes. In practice, I can't guarantee that there's going to be any direct benefit, but I think there's probably a little bit of like background helpfulness that having more native plants and native insects in the background um, will benefit pest population reduction a little bit, hopefully.
Cool. Cool. Another question about the propagation is if cold and or moist stratification is required, can you just seed in the fall to meet those requirements naturally through the winter?
Yeah, a lot of times you can. And that's actually when I talked about my Canvas project back in the beginning, that's actually kind of what I'm looking at specifically. I would say that that's probably going to work the best when you're using a species and stuff from a seed bank that is locally adapted to your area because the temperature and moisture level is theoretically going to be about right for it to germinate. There's, a lot of variation in that too, and soil type affects all that kind of stuff. Um, but my recommendation is that, if you're invested in trying to grow a native plant, maybe try direct sowing some and maybe try growing some indoors and then seeding later and then see which one works better. And also keep in mind, the biology of that plant. And if you direct sow something that needs scarification, it's not going to grow well just from stratification alone. But I would say generally probably yes.
I guess uh, maybe adding on to that or a question is like, then if you direct seed outside, is there more chances for the seed to become contaminated or being consumed by small mammals or, somehow gone at the end of the when you want it there?
Yeah, totally. And there's the potential for it being washed away and all that kind of stuff. And yeah, seed predation. And I think that's going to be site and context dependent as well. Sometimes when I'm seed sowing in like flats, you can put like a little layer of sand on top to like hold the seed in place. So that could be something to maybe do outside as well to prevent the seed from just being like washed away by rain. Especially if it's something that you're sowing very shallowly or just sowing on the surface. But I think that also depends on like how much seed you have to play with. You know, if you have just like a tiny bit of seed that you collected, maybe you want to invest more into worrying about that kind of stuff than if you can just kind of throw out tons and tons of seed into your area.
Yeah. Good, good. Cool. Well, I th that's it for questions. And I think we're after our hour, but really appreciate people hanging around and sticking out for it. And Samuel, really thanks for sharing your knowledge and expertise here. Please come back, everyone. Please come back next month, May 28th, for our next webinar on a Xena Creek restoration project. And yeah, thank you, Sam.
Thank you, Eric.
Yeah, we'll have to touch up base soon. I have questions about Camus. So,
Sounds good.
okay, take care. Bye.